so much for that introduction. That's really great and lovely to learn more about what Khaki is doing, the various activities. So thank you everyone so much for being here. It's great to see so many people have turned up for the talk today. So in this talk, as you already know, we're going to be thinking and exploring early 20th century picture postcards of Bombay. The first question you might ask is, why postcards? Why are we so interested in postcards? Why are we going to be talking to you about them for 45 minutes, an hour today? And if you are asking that question, that's not necessarily surprising, because actually picture postcards were for a really long time somewhat disregarded as a kind of serious subject for scholarly or academic inquiry. They were considered to be nostalgic, kind of ephemeral trivia items, really, something not worthy of serious historical or other kinds of academic attention. But there is now this growing body of literature from anthropologists like ourselves, but also from historians and literacy scholars and geographers, a whole range of people from different subject specialities and kind of interests, who have really started to recognize postcards as this incredible archive, really, deserving of some serious consideration. And not only do postcards need to be analysed critically as popular representations that played a really significant role in constructing, but also disseminating various discourses and stereotypes. And of course, we're thinking about colonial context. So we're thinking of colonial discourses and stereotypes specifically today. But they're also, as I've said, this really huge archive. And they provide quite unique insights into photographic, broader media, and also social histories. And this archive really is vast. When we're saying vast, it really is huge. And we're only able to show you a really small fraction of it today. And it's pretty impossible to estimate accurately or to come up with a kind of really specific figure about just how vast this postcard industry was in the early 20th century. But there are some various figures that we can kind of latch onto to give us some sense of it. So Rogan, for example, has estimated that, and this is a conservative estimate, that between 1895 and 1915, around 200 to 300 billion postcards were in circulation worldwide. So that's a staggering number, and that's quite a conservative estimate. And a huge number of picture postcards were produced of British India. And of all the major cities in British India, from our research, we think it's quite likely that more postcards were produced of Bombay and by Bombay-based companies than any other place at the time. And this really is where our interest in postcards as anthropologists lies. So in my own research, as Farokh has already indicated, I focus primarily on picture postcards of Bengaluru, and I've worked with collectors in the city and examined the production histories of picture postcards, as well as thinking about how they continue to circulate and be engaged with today and remediated and displayed. So since around 2011, I've been slowly collecting my own postcards from ephemera fairs and from online, like eBay and various other online auction sites, and also through family connections. And through this, as well as being very lucky to be able to explore other people's collections and to work with Steve as well, it's become possible to see certain patterns around the kinds of production and aesthetics of picture postcards of India in the early 20th century. But it's also possible to start to see certain anomalies or specificities. So there are certainly tropes and practices that are sort of common across India that we've been able to trace between our different research focuses. But there are also things that are specific about the representation and the postcard industry of Bombay. So hopefully we're going to be able to tease some of that out a little bit in the talk for you today. And I'll hand over to Steve to say a little bit more about his particular interest in postcards and where that's come from.
Yeah, the two of us will be bouncing back and forth as we go along. My own interest in postcards came from a sort of longstanding interest in basically histories of mass media. Much of my other work was on history of early cinema exhibition, and particularly the way that Indian performing arts, music, dance, drama sort of is taken up and translated into forms of mass media over the course of the 20th century. So I looked at things like, obviously cinema, talkies in South India, but also gramophone and radio as well. And so postcards kind of fit in with this set of interests. In fact, I sort of only sort of stumbled on collecting and thinking about postcards seriously when I was looking for social history materials, visual materials for these other histories, and simply sort of realized that there was this gigantic, mountain of postcards, actually a tsunami of paper. That was a fantastic record. And sort of slowly over the years, I have my interest has sort of grown, and it really helped to be working with Emily on this project over the last, I don't know how many years now. Well, probably since 2011, really. We've been talking about postcards together, and so we fueled our own interests, even though we have our separate basis. Most of my work is historical work is in Tamil Nadu, as was mentioned by Farouk earlier, and Chennai in particular. There's no way that you can carry on to think about the postcards without seeing them as part of a larger sort of story comparatively. And certainly, if you want to ask the question about what is unique about the postcards in a particular place, be it Chennai, Bengaluru, or Mumbai, the only way you can begin to do that is actually comparing the different the output and of the different places, figuring out what is sort of unique. So, and that's partly the lesson that what we're going to be able to tell you today about Bombay. Some of the things we've learned is because we have been trying to do this comparative work to think about what is specific about the different places. So I'll hand it back to Emily now, who will take us into the first section of the paper.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so actually this leads on quite nicely from what Steve was just saying about postcards being connected to this kind of larger media story, if you like. And we can extend that into the present day in a way as well, because in many ways, there's some similarities we can draw between picture postcards and social media of the present day. And the first of those that I'm going to mention now is that much like the concerns and sort of wide-ranging discussions that there are around privacy and social media today, there were very similar conversations happening when postcards were first being introduced in the late 19th century. So this was when the postcard was first introduced, as it had no image on the front. It was just space for a message and an address. So this initial postcard really caused a lot of concern amongst particularly amongst middle and upper classes, that the privacy of communication was going to be completely lost, because no longer was it concealed within an envelope, but the postman, or possibly servants, other family members, would now be able to see these correspondences. And that was something that was really hotly kind of debated at the time. But ultimately, these concerns weren't enough to prevent what we've already mentioned is the astonishing popularity of the picture postcard. And that was really taken off with the addition of the image. And that started around 1880s, but really kind of took off 1890s, late 1890s, sort of really booming from sort of 1900 onwards. That's when we start to see the golden age, so-called golden age of picture postcards, when they become this huge phenomenon. So research conducted by Gillen and Hall has revealed, from using the accurate records from the British postal system, and they have the exact number, but I'm not going to repeat it now because it's a very long number, but it's approximately 6 billion postcards passed through the British postal system alone in the first decade of the 1900s. So that's another figure, a more specific figure that gives us some sense of the scale of this postcard industry. And that equates to each individual in the UK at the time sending around 200 postcards every single year. So that's a pretty rapid scale of communication that was taking place. And especially in larger cities across the world, there would be multiple postal deliveries a day. So postcards could be used to send quite rapid communications about very banal things. So updating someone on what time you might expect them to visit that day. So they were a very, as I say, a very rapid form of communication, much more so than we might think of them today when we think of this sort of antiquated, slow form of communication. And the extent of the craze in the UK, but we see similar sort of newspaper articles and discourses coming out from other places as well. But one particularly interesting example that I like to draw on is an article from 1904 in the Liverpool Echo in the UK, which reported that a man had been prosecuted and sentenced to 6 weeks hard labour for stealing close to 5,000 postcards. And what's particularly interesting about this newspaper clipping is that the arresting officer is reported to have said that the man had succumbed to a perfect craze for these cards and couldn't help taking them. So this kind of gives us a sense of this idea that people at the time were really almost kind of overtaken by this craze for picture postcards, that they couldn't control themselves, but from kind of collecting and trying to amass all of these different views. So the huge level of postcard production and the postcard craze of the early 1900s can really, we would argue, be explained by this innovative nature of the postcard as something which, a mode of communication which for the first time allowed people to combine photographic images with personal handwritten text. And this, combined with the increased speed of the postal delivery during this period and the cheaper cost of sending postcards compared to sending a full-length letter, really added to this the popularity and the sort of uptake of the picture postcard. And this is why, in many ways, as I've already mentioned, we can think of picture postcards as an early form of social media. And this is an argument that's also been made by Gillen and Hall that I mentioned a moment ago. So in some ways, we can think of them as the Instagram of the early 20th century. And they were linking people across different locations and providing, as Farrokh mentioned in our introduction, the first affordable form of mass-produced photography. So we'll go on to the next slide. As many of you may well know, cameras first went on sale in India in January 1840. So this was just several months after the announcement of the invention of the daguerreotype in France. So it was taken up very, very quickly and spread across the world extremely rapidly. So after this initial introduction of these cameras, photography was really quickly spreading across India as well. So Christie's research tells us that by 1856, photographic societies had been established in Bombay, but also in Madras and in Kolkata. So by the time picture postcards were gaining popularity and global reach at the turn of the 20th century, photographic technologies had vastly improved from the mid 19th century when cameras were first becoming widely used. So for example, the development of smaller, lighter cameras, the shift to dry gelatin plates that were more portable, as well as the shortening of exposure times, all of these developments meant that photographers could move through the city with much greater ease in search for their sort of perfect picture postcard views that were going to be successful and popular amongst their customers. And so the existing thriving business of studios and photographers and photographic practices and societies really provided this solid infrastructure that enabled postcards to really take off in India and also in Bombay specifically. So in Bombay, where the Photographic Society had been established since 1854, as seen from this quote that you can see on the slide here, numerous photographic studios began producing picture postcards of the city. But what was involved in this production of postcards? It's not quite as simple as you might think. So we'll move on to the next slide. So in the early 20th century, postcard production and consumption really involved extremely complex, often local and global networks. So it wasn't unusual for a photograph to be taken in India, printed in postcard format in Germany or Italy. These were particularly large manufacturing postcard publishing printing centers at the time, and then published by British or Indian companies, sold across India, and then finally sent abroad again with their written messages. So publishers like Raphael Tuck and Sons, and you can see one of their postcards on the top of the slide here, they were headquartered in London, and they produced really large numbers of postcards of locations around the world. So they were big players in the postcard industry, the global postcard industry. But alongside these larger industries, which had this very sort of diverse output in terms of producing postcards of so many different locations, there were also Bombay-based photographic studios which were producing postcards of the city and surrounding areas at the time. So one of the most notable of these was the Bombay Phototype Company, which produce postcards which often have this distinctive logo at the bottom. You can just about see it on the slide here on the bottom image. It's quite hard to make out, but they have this distinctive sort of oval stamp at the bottom of their postcards. But another really significant producer of postcards at the time was Thacker and Co. So you can see this one of their advertisements on the slide here. So many of you will, I'm sure, know that they were a prominent bookseller, but in the early 1900s, they were also listed as publishers, stationers, die sinkers, engravers, relief stampers, copperplate and letterplate printers, bookbinders, newspaper agents, importers of mathematical and surveying instruments. But we can also add to this that they were a significant postcard producer and seller. So alongside the Phototype Company and Thacker and Co, there were also other notable Bombay-based postcard producers. So this included Phoenix P. Works, the Times of India, Clifton and Co, and the Indian Art Press. Now, often it's difficult to find really detailed information about these studios and the individuals who ran and worked in them. But we can start to piece together information from newspapers and gazetteers, census records, and various kinds of directories. And hopefully sometimes this can give us a bit of a fuller picture. It's a bit hit and miss sometimes as to whether you're going to be able to piece these disparate pieces of information together. But for example, we know from the records in the Times and elsewhere that Clifton and Co was established by Harry Clifton Soundy, and he was born in Bombay in 1863 and died in 1922. You can see an image of him here. So before setting up his own studio in 1897, he'd worked as a manager at the Bombay branch of the very well-known, I'm sure you will all have heard of it, of the Bourne and Shepherd studio. So Soundy established his studio just in time to take full advantage of this burgeoning postcard craze of the early 1900s. And after he passed away in 1922, it was his wife who took over the business as proprietress. And in fact, we found that although not common, it wasn't as uncommon as we might expect for women to be involved in the running and the workings of studios and postcard production in the first half of the 20th century. But there were certainly many, many more studios than we've just mentioned that were involved in the postcard industry in Bombay in the early 20th century. And it's also important to recognize that whilst European photographers and companies were really prominent in the postcard industry, and whilst picture postcards were overwhelmingly bought and used by Europeans, there were numerous Indian photographers, studios, and apprentices in the postcard business in India. So there's plenty of evidence to indicate and to demonstrate that Indian photographers and studios played a really important role in the production of picture postcards. And we also know that for these Indian photographers in the postcard trade often targeted a local and Indian market for their postcards. So we can see slightly different aesthetics and subject matters for some of these studios. So in Bombay specifically, one really significant Indian individual connected to the postcard industry was the famous artist M.V. Dhurandhar. So he attended the J.J. School of Art in Bombay and actually became the head of the art school. And he went on to produce many watercolor paintings, which were reproduced as picture postcards. So like the one that you can see on the slide here. And his postcards have this really distinctive style, this watercolor style. And many of them depict people or idealized scenes of daily life in the city or around the city. So we can move on to the next slide now, I think. That's great. Okay, so in addition to these postcards that were produced by studios in large batches, there were also postcards produced in quite small runs. So these could have been produced by studios themselves for particular individual customers, or just for a kind of more niche market. But there were also postcards which were produced of individuals' own postcards purely for their own use. So they may have only produced 5 or 10 postcards to send to friends and family. And this was made possible by the introduction primarily of the Eastman Kodak photosensitive paper that was pre-printed with the design of a postcard back. So this really allowed what's called real photo postcards to take off. And this meant that instead of sending photographs abroad to be printed on lithographic or collotype presses, they could be printed much faster and, as I've said, in small batches in local darkrooms directly onto these postcard backs. And this development really encouraged smaller photographic studios into the postcard market, and it allowed them to produce a more personalized output. So, for example, as I've already indicated, amateur photographers could now even get their own photographs, their personal images produced as postcards. And this was made possible by the Kodak's number 3A folding pocket camera, which was released in 1902, which took postcard-sized photographic film. So there were various versions of this Kodak Brownie camera that came out in the early 1900s. And this, as I've said, permitted people to just produce their own postcard images of the city. So we can see some examples of this, an example of this kind of postcard here. So they're easily identifiable by their shiny as opposed to their matte surface, and they often have the Eastman Kodak symbol on the reverse. So this kind of postcard could have a personal photo on the front, and it's possibly even more akin to social media of today, through which we can share our own personal images alongside our personal written messages or captions. Okay, but as we mentioned earlier, what makes postcards really different from other forms of photography and what contributed to their success was that they were also designed as a form of written communication. So postcards would certainly usually have been selected because of their images, sort of first eye-catching thing which draws your attention to them. But many people bought them specifically for the purpose of writing a brief postal correspondence. And this becomes especially clear in the case of certain collections, which have remained intact since the 1900s. So in these kinds of collections, you might find copies of the exact same postcard, which has been sent multiple times to the same individual, with slightly varying messages over the course of several years. So the space to write on postcards was at first limited by postal regulations, because this originally required that the entire back of the postcard be reserved for the address. So people had to write their messages on small white space on the front of the image in order to add their own little captions or good wishes. So this meant that for a brief period around the turn of the 20th century, people, as I say, had to fit their images into these areas of white space, which were deliberately left around the image on the front of the card so that people could do this. So for example, this postcard on the right here was sent to France and has a brief sort of generic good greeting and good wishes on the front. And the postcard on the left of Elephanta also has a message which you can see has been written sort of horizontally in this white space left to the right-hand side of the image. So with postcards like this, the combination of mass-produced image and personal handwritten text is really immediately apparent. But whenever text was added to a postcard, whether it was the front or on the back, the meaning of the postcard or the status of the postcard as an object was altered. So in some cases, like the one seen here on the next slide, the handwritten text is almost a kind of graphic art. The handwriting here, as I say, is almost this kind of graphic art. So it's transformed the overall aesthetics of the postcard at the same time as providing socio-historical insights into communication and social relations at the turn of the 20th century. But we can also see in this postcard that the stamp actually hasn't been added to the back of the card. You can see the stamp has been added. You can see it indicated here on the back that the stamp has been added to the front. And this, in fact, wasn't uncommon. It's still something that postcard collectors and postcard enthusiasts do today, quite often, is to put the stamp on the front of the card. And this again really reminds us that these objects are not simply photographs. The addition of text makes them a personal multimedia object, whilst the use of a stamp on the top of the image, which often obscures a part of it, is really an evidence of the fact that the postcard has traveled through the postal system and is being used to link people and places together. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Thanks, Steve. Okay, but even with the standard usages and regulations which were in place, people were still extremely creative when they used postcards. So some wrote carefully in spirals around the margins, others wrote their messages in crisscross patterns to try and deter people from trying to read their correspondences, connecting back to what I mentioned earlier about these concerns over privacy. And some people wrote messages on the postcard and then placed them into an envelope to send them along with other images or letters, for example. And from postcard messages, we can also glean insight into the networks of collecting that really proliferated in the early 20th century. So this was as the popularity of postcards was growing, this huge industry for collecting postcards and arranging them in albums really took off. So on the reverse of this postcard, which was produced by the Phototype company that I mentioned earlier, and which was sent from Bombay in 1908, the sender has written, "Dear Miss Beatrice Maynard, I have read your name in Weldon's journal and should like to exchange cards with you. Do you like this kind of card? If not, please let me know what sort of cards you require." So many journals and catalogues, such as this lady's journal, the Weldon Journal, published lists of postcard collectors' names and addresses, and sometimes they would have information about the kind of postcards that these people were particularly interested in, so that collectors could establish these exchange networks with people around the world. And in our collections, we found a lot of examples of postcards with messages such as "another one for your collection," or "do you like this kind of card," which really adds evidence to the sort of popularity of this collecting craze at the time. And there were even postcard collecting competitions, which were organized by large companies like Raphael Tuck and Sons. So for example, you can see the advertisement here in 1903 for a postcard competition to collect a particular series of postcards, and the prize was £2,000. So that's quite a significant sum of money for a postcard collecting competition in the early 1900s. And in the next slide, we can also see a photo of the front of an album, and this is actually from Steve's collection. So postcards would be arranged in these specially designed albums and sort of very carefully curated into particular sequences by the owner. But it's also clear that children often wrote postcards as well. So this wasn't something which was purely sort of amongst adults as a form of communication. And this is possibly because the brevity of the postcard message was particularly appealing to children when they were still learning to read and write. And the image would add this extra layer of attraction for a child potentially. So this postcard of a postman was likely, based on the handwriting, to have been written by a child to Master Eric. And you can see that they've actually written Eric onto the letter or the postcard that's being held by the postman in the postcard image. And the message just quite simply reads, "My dear Eric, I hope you're quite well. I thought you would like to see this card of an Indian postman." So what do we learn from the written and the personalized side of these early postcards of India, including those of Bombay? Well, it's clear from looking at numerous examples that postcard messages were a really innovative and unique writing genre unto themselves at the time. So just a few informal lines of often spontaneously written text, which was much unlike the formal conventions of letter writing at the time. And the content tended to be this quite curious mix of personal information and highly familiar pleasantries. So written to family members, friends, as I've said, often children, that was nonetheless publicly exposed whilst it travelled through this postal system. And many postcards were also written by women, which is perhaps not surprising given that letter writing more broadly at the time was a particularly gendered activity, and picture postcards were considered to be a kind of feminine medium. So whilst some of the messages refer to the image on the front of the postcard, others also make no mention of it at all, or simply provide an address with no personal message anywhere on the card. So there's a huge amount of variety in terms of the information that we can receive from this addition of these handwritten messages. Sometimes we might be able to gain a lot of insight into the social history of the people writing, and at other times we may be left with very scant information. And here I'm going to hand over to Steve.
Thank you, Emily. So having looked at some of the messages you might find on postcards, and having discussed certain of the aspects of their production, imagine everyone's eager to get a better look at more of the postcard images themselves. And this is of course what draws our attention to this medium in the first place, is their beautiful visuality. And it's clear that the publishers themselves went to great efforts to make them aesthetically pleasing, eye-catching, for what was largely, at least at first, really aimed at a kind of European audience in India. They expected the postcard trade was something that happened out, happened in Europe, North America, spread around the world, came to India. And we'll talk a little bit more about who's the main market here. It's not just Europeans. It's clearly that is the primary market. To be sure, postcards drew on previous visual styles for representing the city, but because of their mass production and wide circulation, they were much more powerful in defining the sort of visual identity of Bombay than any other forms in the early 20th century. The postcard is a kind of pictorial vocabulary that translates this urban environment into sites that can be isolated, recorded, dropped in the mail, or collected and organized into scrapbooks. As such, these postcards are not so much a window on the past as a set of, if you like, discursive visual coordinates that articulated a kind of social and cultural geography of the city and its inhabitants, really, not only for themselves, but also for a global audience. This is Bombay speaking to the world, if you will, through these images. So in this sense, postcards reflect, in some ways, British colonial understandings and planning of the cities in India, which was based on sort of European distinctions between public and private space, divisions between Indian and European populations within the city. But because these were not produced for official government purposes, we can't actually collapse them to the kind of coordinated work of a colonial government in India. And because of the scale of the production, I think postcards offer a far more complex, blurred reality of sort of urban life and what was a very cosmopolitan place such as Bombay. So it's very difficult as we are about ready to sort of look at a range of these images. It's very easy for us to I mean, the meaning of these postcards is not inherent in them. And much the way that we read them today says more about ourselves. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be looking at a series of general views of the city of Bombay. Postcards, as I mentioned, are kind of a conventional system for visually representing urban life, which remains surprisingly intact for over a century. You look at contemporary postcards that are produced for Bombay, you see really some very strong similarities with what was being produced at the beginning of the 20th century. And these conventional ways of representing the city pretty much spread everywhere in the world. So each each of these postcards offers a kind of emblematic image of the city that is meant to encapsulate and visually materialize a site. Patience on that little technical difficulty. Okay, so each was an emblematic image of the city that meant to sort of encapsulate, visually capture a site, and it's produced as an object, sold, bought, written on, taken, or sent to other peoples. So most of these postcards' presumed address was not the residents themselves, but was meant for visitors or people who may not have been familiar with the city. However, they're produced by people who are also demonstrating a certain civic pride, a pride in their place. And you can see a lot of that is these postcards, if you're thinking as a form of rhetoric, they're saying, and particularly general, isn't Bombay a fantastic place? So they're showing off the vistas, the views, the built environment, imposing buildings. And with each of these panoramas we're going to show, they try to capture the city in one go as one place. They're privileging a sense of wholeness and a shared sense of Bombay that, in a sense, covers up its multiplicities. And this is a very early one, which is leaving space around the side for the message, which wasn't written here. This is a rather dramatic view of Colaba, which will surprise many. You see nothing but temporary tents along the shore there. This is the fort. Probably recognizable from the view today from Hill. That's sort of the reverse side of that. Next, sort of the other main genre besides these general views were notable buildings. And I think, Emily, are you going to take over on the section?
Yeah, thank you. So given what Steve said about the postcards being used to project particular visualizations of the city, it's not surprising that notable and in particular public buildings were a really significant category of picture postcards at the time. And major architectural projects were used, as I'm sure many of you will already know, were used in colonial India as part of an attempt to project discourses of the power and the achievements of British rule, and as Steve has already mentioned, to convey the sense of civic pride. So in this sense, these buildings were creating a kind of symbolic urban landscape that became part of the fabric of everyday life. And these built landmarks wrote a particular narrative that visually and materially enacted the link to empire through the rule of law, through institutions of government, and through the representation and celebration of the monarchy and military heroism. And postcards really extended this logic of visualization of these particular colonial discourses in the reproduction of these monumental landscapes on this huge scale. So they also intensified and consolidated attention to these sites in a manner that allowed people to write them into their own lives and then send them on to others. And we must, of course, remember that in the early 1900s, when these postcards were being produced, many of these buildings were actually new additions to Bombay's urbanscape. So we look at them now as these heritage old buildings, but at the time, these were new additions to the city. And this is really explicitly conveyed in the message we can see on this postcard here, which reads, "Dear brother, this is one of the buildings in Bombay. They have just done it up and it looks well." So this kind of really reminds us that these were not old buildings at the time that these postcards were being.
And if I may interject, please do look at the foreground of that picture, because what we see is the message says it's a really fantastic new building, but you can see what's happened there is a shed that's corrugated tin that's all been pulled down, right? So it's perhaps it's a construction shed, something that was used in the making. Who knows? Maybe they're clearing some other buildings to make space for it. But it's interesting to see that juxtaposition.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah,
Emily?
Exactly. And so Steve's just going to run through some examples now of different public buildings in Bombay And when we look at these, we can see the different styles, the classical, Victorian Gothic revival, and Indo-Saracenic styles in the various different architectures of these buildings. And the composition of these images really also incorporated prior artistic conventions, such as, for example, European landscape painting and the picturesque. So the buildings are often relatively depopulated, or the figures, if they are present, really essentially work to provide us with a sense of scale, to make the buildings look even more impressive and large and dominating. And the figures often also show a kind of lack of dynamism or engagement with the structure behind. So these postcards are really emphasizing the permanence and the scale and the solidity of these new public institutions or significant notable buildings in the city. So I'm sure you're all going to be very familiar with a lot of the commonly depicted public and notable buildings that we see represented on postcards, some of which we've just run through, and indeed some of them are still going to be common subjects of picture postcards today. And here I'm going to pass back over to Steve.
In addition to buildings and monuments, the street scenes were another very important genre in sort of global postcard trade, and Bombay specifically as well. So, and the development of photographic technology played a role here, particularly in the late 19th century. As we mentioned, cameras got smaller, more portable, allowed for greater mobility, sort of moving out of the confines of photographic studio. Postcards sort of follow the kind of emerging modernist trends, 20th century painting and photography. And it's exploring more sort of intimate and sort of quotidian representations of city streets. And the street scene was certainly a favorite topic for postcards during early 20th century, and Bombay is no exception. You could sort of argue that the postcard craze sort of specialized in street scenes. So these kind of postcards narrate a kind of peripatetic story of how one would experience the city on your feet. So think of these images as a kind of walking tour of that was meant to immerse the viewer, at least imaginally, in the sights, sounds, even smells of the city. And so street scene postcards allowed for kind of postal correspondents to comment on and share their own urban experience with others. While some postcards are labeled their image with streets at specific road and neighborhood names, others presented them in typical category, a native street in Bombay, for example, this one. And this allowed postcard writers to kind of choose between locating their narrations at specific places. We see some of these postcards where somebody has circled a building or a window saying, "This is where I stayed," or "This is where our shop is," or something. Or they can just go along with the caption and sort of kind of provide a kind of stereotype of the street. Some specific locations. This is sort of muddy, but produced by the Times of India, this one. A thoroughfare and a bazaar. Right? So it's going to be, I mean, you would sort of work on it. You could probably find out from maybe this minaret here. You perhaps have some idea. It'll be totally unrecognizable today. Another major genre of postcards at the time were that of religious topics. They featuring all kinds of religious buildings, practices for Bombay. It's Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, and Christian. And unlike other places in India where postcards focused on religious monuments and architecture, you think about all the Mughal architecture through North India. Those were always featured in postcards. If you look at the Delhi output, there are almost all these sort of monuments, these sort of Mughal architecture, really. But in Bombay, the religious postcards is tended to show a religious practice in the way of worship, pilgrimage, and festivals. Of course, this is an architectural wonder. The church one is, but of course, this is the I'm particularly like this one here is we have it's the Ponderoga, it's the Vital, it's it's the major, still a major pilgrimage in Maharashtra, but of course we also see the mosque minaret in the background. Hard to know whether that was intentional or not, but it's a wonderful little monument to the sort of religious synchronism there. But out of all the religious events, of course, yes, the Ganapati festivals is well known to any resident of Bombay. It's featured on postcards, as the Coconut Festival, one of the most common of the religious postcards, but not the most common one. Certainly, all the religious, of course, Parsis are very much part of the special sort of social identity of Bombay. They had prominent places in society, particularly in the late and early 20th century. This is an early lithograph production, sort of rare. They moved on to sort of later on. These are halftone printing. Here we see the phototype company in Bombay clearly recognized. It's the same company produced a different postcard of the same scene. If you want to sort of compare the two, basically it's the same thing. But this was the updated technology of color printing that was coming into view there. But of all the most widely religious postcards, it's those depicting this Muslim observance of Muharram. And from what I can tell, this one and this next one, I think particularly this one, was the best-selling postcard of Bombay in the early 20th century, just for the sheer number of those that are in circulation. And it might sort of surprise contemporary residents of Mumbai that think that the Ganapati festival had pride of place. However, as Jim Maslows has pointed out, before the rise of the Ganesh Puja processions at the beginning of the 20th century, Mumbai was much better known for its Muharram processions. These were the largest, most spectacular public events in the city. That was not only for Shia, because this is a Shia Muslim event sort of commemorating the death of Hussein at the Battle of Karbala, but Sunni Muslims, Christians, Parsis, all communities came in for the spectacle as well. So yeah, that's a very common one. But we're going to move now on to the last of the categories we're going to focus on, and that is portraits of people, actually residents of Bombay itself. Indians in these portraits were identified variously according to their ethnicity, gender, religion, caste, but most often their means of employment. Very often they're carefully staged in studios. Others were taken like documentary photographs in situ in city streets and public places. But for the most part, these postcards did not name the Indians pictured as individuals, but categorized them according to these generic social types. I mean, like these as we say are occupationals, but sometimes, as we'll see in other examples, they were sort of more abstract or creative captions were used. And together, this vast archive of ordinary residents of Bombay provide rare insights, glimpses into the lives of ordinary people that otherwise would have been completely lost to history. They may in some ways encourage stereotypes, but these portraits often give Bombay residents a degree of dignity that would not otherwise have been offered to them in their normal working lives. I'll go through a number of examples organized by publishers to get an overall sense of these portraits. But before I move on, I want to just point out one little detail. Different companies actually produced the same image of this policeman in color and black and white. There's another story of maybe copyright violation there. But particularly one thing I like about this this postcard of the barber is that they decided in producing it to show us where the backdrop ended. So here we see the colonial, the backdrop that we very common in a photographic studio, but there we see actually what was behind it. So we see its artificiality was meant to kind of create, the backdrop was meant to create a kind of realistic effect of being outside in a garden, or some rural spot. But there we see the door. It's probably taken outside anyway. I'm not entirely sure, and you can see that it's a much older photograph, and in this place that it had a written caption that was etched onto the negative. It says "Barber" here, but when they produced it as the postcard, they sort of smudged it out, and we can still legible, but and added their own printed category. All these images were worked over very much afterwards in the studio to produce them as images. Again, occupational, taken on the streets. Okay, now the first company I want to pay attention to, which we've already mentioned before, is Clifton and Co. Harry Clifton Soundy was a professional photographer by trade. So it's not surprising that almost all of his postcards were very much framed by the conventions of studio photography. And this is a very standard setting. You see the painted backdrop, you see, furniture, carpet, rugs, the whole bit. And certainly Clifton during the early craze was one of the most prolific of the Bombay producers. Helped set a sort of a trend for a lot of the other companies. A lot of his pictures seem to have been even photographs ripped off and produced as postcards by other companies. I mean, he seems to mostly specialize in topographical postcards, not only in Bombay, but of other places as well. I'll give you a sense of some of his other portraits to get a style of it. These lavishly colored half-tone prints, beautiful production values, were printed in Germany, and were the style at the very beginning of the 20th century. As you move into, certainly by the 1920s, there's a style for more photorealism that tend to be sort of black and white images, such as this one. This one, I believe, was produced by Clifton and Company in the 1920s. And here, this is a kind of documentary photo on the streets. Clearly, we're out of the studio. We're in the, you can almost smell this image with the fire moving in the back. This is a kind of, would have been a kind of a scene of a work culture that would not otherwise have been accessible. It's an urban dairy in Bombay. The next company I want to focus on is the Phototype Company of Bombay, who were perhaps sort of over the course of the early decades of the 20th century, they probably were the most prolific postcard producer, printer. They are also a stationery supplier. They sold large numbers of postcards from other companies, including Tux, but they produced a large number of their own postcards as well. And this is a very early postcard of them. You can see that it was meant for the message to be written on the side of the image there, and they've given their name on the side over here, the photograph company Bombay, but not their logo yet. So this was before they settled on a logo. And of all genres of postcards, I think that they specialize more in portraits of people, and their work sort of marked significantly by a style early on, by a style of studio photography. He's not on this bicycle. It looks odd in the street. Clearly, a sort of with the carpet on the bottom is an indoor location. Anyway, staged. but they go on to develop, the phototype company goes on to develop their own sort of unique style with sort of creative captions that sort of defy easy stereotypes. We get, and they're clearly also catering to Indian audiences. You know, obviously with the Congress, great Marathi Congress leader Gokhale, this is cards that were meant to be purchased by Indians themselves. And even what is a sort of notch, sort of courtesan style performer, Rama Devi, would have likely appealed to Indian audiences as well. They also very much focused on women. There's this idea that they're producing sort of glamour images. That this is before, you know, you have the advertisements or glamour images that are now we associate with you know, cinema stars over the course of the 20th century. There's this idea of selling a kind of glamorous image of Indian women here in this case. I'm sure you could talk a lot about the embroidered choli blouse or the lovely lace work on the long sort of billowy shirt of the Bombay beauty. And they worked on the genre and became and developed it into something somewhat different. And insofar as they started sort of identifying them according to this sort of more abstract sort of activities. So the model clearly striking a pose for the camera. What's unique about these is that they're not named as people exactly, but they're not types either. These women are not. They're expressing a feeling. They're not representing a social category, like a certain caste or religion or occupation necessarily. They are in a sense asking us to look at them for their own style, for what they're doing. In a sense, their own self-presentation. Of course, it is a studio production, but they are something about themselves are there. And there's a fantastic range of images that they produced in this style, largely focused on women. We might now think that this reflected a kind of, you know, the male gaze objectifying women. I can't deny that that's not part of the story, but these postcards of women were very much more likely to be purchased and written by women and sent to other women. So that changes the way we might think about what is the work of these images doing. These are ways to women about what they're wearing, what their jewelry is, and other kinds of things. Asking to think of them as icons of feminine style, perhaps. This is one of my favorites of them all, is and this is particularly unusual because it's telling a story about women, children playing, and this is out of the studio. We're in a very different kind of space, away from this painted backdrop, the upholstery furniture, and standard props. We get a kind of almost modernist, clean architectural lines in the background. Of course, it's posed, and the children look very very strangely serious about it all. But it does sort of create a kind of narrative image that lets us into a kind of child's world of play, unlike anything I've seen in other postcards. So Phototype sort of developed their own kind of narrative style and their images that we could show more of them that are doing something very different than the sort of native type stereotypes that are associated with these portrait genres more generally. The last of the publishers I'm going to focus on here is Thackers & Co., which we mentioned earlier when Emily was talking. They were well-known booksellers. They did not have their own separate studio practice. They were unlike, you know, Clifton, that was a photographic studio that went into postcards. This is basically a well-known bookshop that sold lots of postcards that branched down into producing their own. So you shouldn't be entirely surprised that what marked out at the portraits of Thacker and Co. was that their portraits were all taken in locations on streets, public places in Bombay, and I sort of find the set of images from Thacker's sort of the most compelling of all the sort of portrait pictures. They literally, the photographers have gone out onto the street and encountered different kinds of people and taken their photographs. I don't know, if these people were paid, what these people got out of this transaction, but it's very interesting to see that the assortment of people that can be found, that these vendors, street vendors that can be found if you were walking through the streets in the beginning of the early 20th century. There's a whole series of other images where they have sent their photographers into the public parks of Bombay. And they take pictures of these sea gentlemen, a lawyer or a clerk, people that are hired to walk dogs, a whole range of other people. It's quite clearly organized like people you would meet if you were walking in the public parks of Bombay. And what I appreciate about all this is a kind of almost a sort of documentary effort to characterize what makes Bombay residents unique. And the last example I'll use here before we wrap up is they did a series of photographs of vendors. Again, we're in another public place. Here we see this native doctor, but Hakeem, what's particularly interesting about this is that they got down on the ground level. They got down to the level of their subject. This low angle is actually is very unique for amongst these portrait photographs, other companies and other people. They would have gone to considerable effort to sort of get down to this level. And particularly here, they're almost looking up to this gentleman. This perhaps is my favorite of the Thacker images, but this is a kind of gaze that's looking him eye to eye. That would not be the case if you were buying this mineral water. He would have been standing. He would have served you from the top of his box. And so this with this we'd like to sort of move on to and wrap up. Thank you for your patience. Emily, do you want to take over here?
Yeah, thank you. Just to wrap up with a couple of brief sentences, just to say that through this presentation, we really have only begun to scratch the surface of the many, many different postcards that were produced in and of Bombay in the early 1900s. And we've only begun to attempt to unpack the ways in which this medium served to both reinforce colonial stereotypes as well as to produce an immense archive of the complexities of urban life and social relations at the start of the 20th century. So what we hope to have demonstrated in this limited time that we've had is really the significance of picture postcards as a medium through which we can develop a critical and a unique, a particular insight into colonial discourses, but also into everyday urban life, representational strategies, and communication media histories of the early 20th century. So over the next few weeks, I also just wanted to let everyone know that we'll be featuring some of these postcards of Bombay and providing some more detail around them on our Instagram account, which you can find at Picture Postcard Empire. Steve showing some of the ones which we're hoping
these are all this is the Bombay stack I have in my collection. So we have a long ways to go before we've exhausted them.
So please do follow us if you're interested in seeing more postcards of Bombay or elsewhere in India. And otherwise, just thank you very much for listening.
We're not going to let you off so easily, Emily and Stephen. There are a score of questions. Let's get to them. With your permission.
Please, fire away.
Okay. So what was the oldest picture postcard you've come across in your study?
Oldest in India?
Oldest in India?
The oldest are at the last years of the 19th century.
Okay.
I've seen, 1898. It really is interesting enough. It's the exact same time that cinema arrives in India. The two are sort of new media, really at the same time.
Okay. I guess we have an economist in our midst. Nikhil Varma wants to know what was the average selling price in rupees or paisa of a premium quality postcard.
Yeah, I mean, it is, the premium quality would be the color ones. And they can be, in fact, we have prices here. I don't know if anyone, you can actually see the price that's listed on there. That's rupees, that's what, 10 Anna? Am I getting that right?
1 rupee, 0 rupees, 1 Anna. So that would be like 6 paisa approximately.
Yeah. So that is fairly cheap, really, for what is what would have been a sort of, well, I mean, they were accessible to a fairly large, I mean, you had to be a wage earner, right? You had to be you're not going to get casual labor being able to afford these. And of course, postcards require a certain sort of literacy, right? So you had to have had education and comfortable with reading and writing, right? So that already would have self-selected the kind of people that would have had access, in addition to sort of the economic factor of buying them.
Another economic model kind of question. Would the photographers sell the pictures as a one-time transaction, or was there any form of syndication between the photographer and the studio? That's
a really good question. And I mean, Steve might want to add something else, but I would say it's really hard to know, actually. It's difficult to find records of the transactions that went on behind the scenes of postcard production. So, you find, as Steve mentioned in the talk, that there'll be images which you see being produced by very small independent kind of studios, which would have, most likely had a photographer based in that studio taking the image for the studio specifically, and then producing as a postcard. But then you can see that same image being taken up and produced by these larger companies. And it's very hard to know. I've not yet found any documentation as to how that happened, whether these images were kind of copyright infringed, or whether there was a transaction taking place that kind of sold the rights of a whole collection of images, or whether it was specifically for particular runs of postcards. So it's very hard to give an answer to that question. I don't know if Steve wants to add anything.
Yeah, I think it's different for each sort of photographic for the work of each photographer. That we know that one of the things that happened is somebody had been running a photographic studio, and when they pass away, that the business goes on to their family. And at that point, we often see that a lot of the older photographs get sold on to postcard companies to make postcards, right? So that the family is trying to make income off of what's left of the photographic business. They're interested in selling them on and making money that way. So we've seen, certainly I've seen that in a number of occasions. That actually happens, after Dean Dial passes away, in the years after he passes away, we see the first time his photographic collections being produced into postcards in that regard. So there's no doubt that the photographers it's another stream of income, but the people that are in the photographic, in the postcard business, there are photographic studios that are branching out to see this as an extra economic way of selling their products. You have people who are companies like booksellers, stationers that are selling postcards, who see this as really good business, and so that they bring in their own photographers to sell them. Those are the two main operators who get involved in this business early on. I would say that's the photographers and the paper merchants.
I guess that answers Akhil Reddy's question on piracy. How many cards were printed of Dhurandhar paintings? Keshav wants to know.
Lots, 20, 25.
Okay.
Omar Khan, who's actually done a lot of work on cards of Bombay, in his book Paper Jewels, and on the website has yeah, he has a really long selection of postcards by Dhurandhar on the website, so you can have a look there. But there are quite a number, but I wouldn't know exactly how many.
And there's other scholarship on that if you want to look up. There's other scholars have done specific work. Art historians have done specific work on the postcards of Dhurandhar. So there is quite amongst sort of early Indian postcard artists. There's probably more work on him publicly available than others.
Okay, Anu wants to know what are some of the sites or places where you can buy and sell postcards?
Now. So eBay online is a big sort of market for postcards, but there's also some specific online markets for ephemera. So places like Delcamp sells a lot of postcards, but also other kind of philately related items and things like coins, these kinds of things. And postcard fairs are another really big, I mean, obviously at the moment that these things aren't running as frequently across the world, but you know, pre-pandemic, postcard fairs would run pretty regularly in various locations around the world. And that's certainly where Steve and I have got quite a lot of our postcards from. So, you know, you go into these huge halls and you'll find stacks and stacks of postcards, and you'll just have to filter through them. And they'll typically be organized by various categories, depending upon the seller of the postcards. They might be organized by place or by kind of subject matter or sort of thematic organization. So they're probably the three.
Yeah, in India, you could find them in sort of people sell antiques and antiquary shops, and I think Bombay has there's more of them kicking around in Bombay than in the sort of major metros that I've seen. And there is a kind of thriving market for these in India as well. I mean, the thing about them is that they were written and sold and collected, and they were valuable for a certain generation of people. And those people often saved their collections because they were part of, you know, their family history. There's a whole set of connections, friends and things. They were treasured objects. These people started dying in the part of the middle part of the 20th century, and so these collections passed on to their families. Maybe their families kept them because they were valued from there, but eventually they get all by the end of the 20th century, like 80s and 90s. There's a tsunami of these old papers, these collections that just sat in boxes and catalogs, and drawers, gathering dust for almost a century. And they've come out, and a lot of them probably thrown out, but they kind of tapped into a kind of collector's market that is global. And unlike photography, which historical photographs are really expensive, because there were so many postcards that were produced. Like these objects are second-hand objects. You'll in the UK you'll pay a couple pounds. I guess they go out. They're more expensive if you buy them on eBay because they get auctioned and the price goes up quite high.
Okay. Okay. So how significant were photographs for picture postcards? Because some of them did look like lithographs or sketches. Did photography comprise the bulk of the images?
By far and away. Even the lithographs are based on photographs.
Okay.
Yeah.
The observation.
I showed you two pictures of a Parsi fire temple. Yeah.
Yep.
And if you look carefully, they're probably from the same photograph. But they've been composed differently. The lithograph has maybe added people in, but there's if you look carefully between the two of them, I didn't take the time to do it, but it's clear that the same people that are in the two different versions.
Mm.
Um,
So Vinayak wanted to know if you've tried finding the exact location of some of these postcards where the location was not mentioned.
Yes, we have, particularly for Bengaluru and Chennai, where we've done most of our postcard work.
Okay.
But we actually have not taken our Bombay postcards onto the street of Mumbai to match them up. Partly is because yeah, it would be a specific. I mean, we'd love to do that, but we haven't actually sort of gotten around to that.
Which brings me to Lata's question. How many Bombay postcards have you collected and how were you able to get? Okay, how were you able to guess this? You've already answered. So I think she would like to know how many Bombay postcards were you able to collect in the course of your study?
Stu's getting his.
I don't know. Yeah, I have mine. This many, and that's probably somewhere 300 to 350.
Okay.
I have far fewer, but we've also done a lot of kind of online surveying. So even when we've not purchased cards, we've been keeping records from, you know, when we've come across them for our own purposes, just kind of get a broader sense of you know, what's being represented and the kinds of messages we're seeing and things. Because yeah, it's you have to be a bit limiting, otherwise you can end up spending too much money.
Yes.
Collecting these postcards, it can run away from you.
Yeah, I had advantage of starting my postcard collecting earlier than Emily. I've probably got more than a decade head start, but when I first started, these were very inexpensive. And I think over time these have become more of collector's items, and there's a much bigger market. So you'd have to be fairly wealthy to be able to get large numbers.
Shivangi makes an observation that very few representations of Europeans on the postcards. Would that be a correct observation?
Do you want to?
Yes. Yeah, I think they're comparatively rare, but I guess there are Europeans featured in postcards as well in India, but perhaps not as much.
I think often as well, you find there are quite a lot of real photo postcards of Europeans. So people who have gone to a studio or have taken photographs of themselves specifically to send an image of themselves in a particular location back to friends and family. So that kind of, it's, you know, it tells us about the particular audience makeup of the postcard market at the time. So that kind of an image, for example. Yeah.
And this is Merry Christmas 1927, right? So this was a postcard that was produced as a family portrait and then produced as a postcard. They probably sent it out to all their families, you know. So.
Which brings me to my question. How did this industry vibe with the cabinet card making industry, where you took a photograph of yourself, probably staged, made a tableau, and then mailed it out for Parsi New Year or Christmas or whatever?
Cabinet card was a specific moment in a particular size card that emerges in just before the postcard. In a way, you can say postcards replace cabinet cards as an object, right? As a particular size and thickness of the card. They're much thicker and larger than a postcard. The postcard size was determined by postal regulations, and you know, of course, it was the weight is all involved. However, the style of you know, studio photograph, where you troop the family in, or you get your elders in to take the photograph, is carried on, you know, from the practice carries on from the cabinet. The cabinet size photograph is the first instance where families can actually have portraits of themselves, right? You know, earlier, the only way you'd have a portrait of yourself is you commission a painter, right? And this wasn't accessible to everyone. Cabinet is the first sort of means where you sort of middle class people can have portraits of themselves. And since that democratization, it becomes easier and easier in the postcard format for families to produce their own self-portraits. Postcards is.
We are running out of time and there are many, many more questions. So I'm just going to take two and request your indulgence to answer them. Were there any instances that you notice about seditious postcards? You know, the fledgling freedom movement. Was there any did picture postcards play a role in that?
Yes, definitely. We didn't feature any of those today. There were large numbers of postcards produced in protest by the Swadeshi movement, protesting the partition of Bengal. There are large numbers of postcards of leaders in the Congress Party already from the beginning of the 20th century. So before, you know, Gandhi and Nehru come on the scene, you have a series of postcards that were produced quite clearly for Indian, you know, nationalists, and not looking for a European market per se. Did you want to give some other examples, Emily?
No, that's what I was thinking of as well. Yeah.
Ganesh Shivaswamy wants to know, did Reinhardt make any illustrations specifically for the Bombay market? P. Reinhardt is his question.
There was a company called Rheingold who produced postcards for Bombay. I'm not clear. I mean, I don't know who the Reinhardt he's referring to. Maybe you gave more clarification on that. There, of course, the one thing we haven't talked about is the Ravi Varma press. It was based in Carlisle. Had German technicians working with, you know, the sort of Ravi Varma image production machine that was going on. Were major producers as well. They're producing ornithological subjects. We all know the topics of those.
Thank you very much, Emily and Stephen. We've come to the end of the questions. It is a hard stop. There are a few which I haven't presented to you, but we are at 7:30 now. So I think we need to call it a day or an evening. Thanks, everybody. Do keep on watching our social media and do attend as many events as you can. Do join in tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. The family quiz promises to be fun. And we have the virtual walk coming up tomorrow too. Thanks again, Emily and Stephen. Good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.